Is the fifth video on Davis' speech. This is a short one, the last one, and he leaves us with a pretty profound message. It's almost like he was psychic and he knew what was to come, because he told us in the speech to Congress, which we're reading now, and we see that what he's saying has in fact been occurring. Think to yourself while I go through this stuff. The recent phrase, "You'll own nothing and be happy," because Davis has called it back in 1841. So the most important part of this video is, I think, where Davis says some of the following things. And what I mean is the series of videos. So out of all the videos, this is probably the most important. He says, "And to secure this end, this government is made dependent on the state governments." So the federal government's dependent on the state governments, which I've explained. It's the federal state and it's dependent on the states. It's not the other way around. "In order that they may watch its courts and protect the people and themselves from its encroachment and oppression. This is the informing soul, the vital principle, the living genius of the whole system, that this government is dependent on the states and not the states dependent upon it." So Davis goes on to talk more about the bill and how it throws power at the federal government, taking it away from the states. We see that this bill allows the federal government to take the lands, the public lands, then sell it and collect the money and give it back to the states without specification of using it for educating the poor, that this is like a money laundering system. It's an usurpation of power. So the states are bound to the people, but the federal government isn't, because the federal government never had authority over the people of the states. They only have authority over, to some extent, the states, but really the dependent states and not the independent states, except for military purposes. So Davis says, "It throws power by necessity into this government. I cannot contemplate it as some gentlemen seem to regard it. I look upon it as the commencement of a system fatal to liberty." He calls it, quote, "a system of measures which goes to change the Constitution and to subvert all the principles of civil liberty, to keep up a democracy of forms while we have an aristocracy in fact and substance." So an aristocracy is a small group commanding or governing the many, and in fact is de facto in this country. So de facto means by fact and not by right. By right is de jure. I used to be confused about what exactly was meant by these two terms, and I read an example that might help you understand, and I'll share that with you. And it's really quick and short. "A king who inherits the throne through his bloodline is a king by right, or de jure, due to his bloodline. If the king decides to travel away from his kingdom and he leaves someone else in charge, that person is king in fact, or de facto, but not by right, de jure. If the king by right returns to claim his throne and the king in fact does not return it, he is still the king in fact, but not by right." So what Mr. Davis is saying is we have a government in fact because it is usurping power and holding that power for itself outside the Constitution, but because they're not following the Constitution, they are not a government by right. Stealing elections are the same thing. The usurpers become a Congress in fact because they take the offices, but they don't take them through a proper election. So they are not office holders by right because it was stolen. The same with the Constitution. When they follow the Constitution, they are a government by right because they rightfully inherit the power from the people. When they do not follow the Constitution, it is not by right, but since they hold the offices and the power, they are governing de facto or in fact. This is what Napolitano means as far as I understand him when he says it is not the way it's supposed to be, but it is what we have. It is an unconstitutional government, but still holding those offices, still holding the power. They are a government in fact, but not by right. By right, they'll follow the Constitution. By fact, they do not, but they still have the power. So Davis continues, that measure subverts the Constitution and poisons the legislation of the Union. It will give to this government power over the states, destructive of their constitutional action in our system. For it will be the worst of all powers, the power of corruption, which buys when it cannot reason and bribes when it cannot buy, a power which is never idle and never content, but which eternally toils for its own increase, and against whose encroachments the people must keep a sleepless watch or bid adieu forever to their much-loved freedom. I consider this bill as aiming a fatal blow to the rights of the states at their independence, their safety, and their power. Davis mentions the other scheme, a national bank, would soon follow the scheme of the federal sale of state public lands, its increase in power, etc., which we know today has in fact occurred through the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And so you'll own nothing and be happy is now. So he says, I regard that system as tending to throw power into the hands of this government by abstracting, I've talked about abstracting it from the people. So making it vague, taking out the details, avoiding the important things, and painting a picture of something that is not reality. It's not, in fact, the picture, it's something else. So he says, abstracting it from the people to bring the action of the government into the immediate contact with the business and labor of the community. It aims through the agency of money, power, and by artificial mode of commerce and banking to control labor, which they're doing now, to shape the business, which they're doing now, and to manage the real estate of every individual, which they're doing now, and thus ruling the labor, which they're doing now, the business, they're doing it, and the property of the people, they've done it, to rule the country, which they don't have a right to do, to establish a power superior to the people, such as the one in Europe as a thrown down power. So it wasn't that hard once he recognized that they wanted to flip the power into the aristocracy or the few, that we would end up with a system just like the European system, which is exactly what the founders, we think, didn't want. So does this sound anything like you'll own nothing and be happy? This is the European system that the federal government wants to institute in America by fact, not by right. This is a thrown down system of power at the top and none for the people that Davis is making known for us in his speech. And he does this way back in 1841. Okay, so here's your Davis speech. I'll post a link to it. I hope you enjoyed listening to this and hearing his ideas, the ideas that he talked about in 1841 that I discovered prior to reading this speech that I was kind of floored to find out what he was saying in here.